Welcome. We're glad that you're here. We look forward to your testimony on the President's budget for this department, and so that we can have Homeland Security for the fiscal year 2014. Madam Secretary, once again, DHS finds itself at a crossroads. As our budgetary constraints tighten and true threats to the homeland persist, DHS must find a way to accomplish its vital mission with increasingly scarce resources. Specifically, DHS must find a way to adequately support its costly workforce and necessary operations, including enforcement, and also follow through on essential upgrades on border security technology, Coast Guard acquisitions, and necessary research. Budgeting for competing priorities with limited resources is not a new challenge. In fact, it's been the hallmark of the Appropriations Committee work since 1865. And that's why this subcommittee has adhered to three core principles since its establishment more than 10 years ago. Unwavering support for our frontline personnel and essential operations is the first. Secondly, clear alignment of funding to results. And finally, true fiscal discipline, meaning we provide every dollar needed to Homeland Security, but not a penny more. And that brings us to the Department's budget request for fiscal year 2014 and recent events. First, your FY14 budget prioritizes and sort of defies logic. The more money for headquarters consolidation and research, but deep, shameful proposals to cut operations, including a proposed reduction of 826 Coast Guard military personnel, a proposed cut of nearly 40% to Coast Guard acquisitions, a proposed reduction of 2,200 ICE detention beds, and a proposed reduction of more than 1,000 full-time positions in ICE, resulting in substantial decreases to investigation into everything from threats to national security, to child exploitation, to cyber crime, to drug smuggling. Secondly, what I've seen in the last few months, what I believe is apparent with this budget request, is a complete lack of candor, and that's something that, as chairman, I cannot and will not tolerate. I'm not talking about information on internal policy deliberations or pre-decisional discussions with the administration. I'm talking about facts. Facts about what things cost, and the facts about actual performance. Madam Secretary, statutory mandates and reporting requirements within our bill are not flexible. They are the law. What I'm getting at is the department's repeated failure to submit numerous required plans and reports on time. This includes nearly all of the 12 reports and plans that were statutorily mandated to be submitted with the budget yesterday morning. Now, we did receive some late yesterday evening, I understand about three reports required, but quite honestly, with the thousands and thousands and thousands of people that you've got over there in your department, and the law requiring a priority date for the submission of these reports, I see no good excuse why you can't find enough people that know how to do their job over there if they can't get these reports put together. Furthermore, what I'm getting at is the department's failure to answer basic factual questions about program costs and performance. We've asked repeatedly about mandatory E-Verify costs. We've asked repeatedly about resource implications of the new USCS programs. We've asked for updated information about the department's sequester impacts, given that the fiscal year 2013 appropriation bill was enacted more than 2 weeks ago, and 3 weeks after the unwarranted release of thousands of ICE detainees, I had to hold a hearing to get an entirely confusing and incomplete accounting of the incident, including that ICE released 10 Level 1 criminal aliens and 159 Level 2 criminal aliens. Madam Secretary, let's be blunt. If DHS can't explain how it's proposing to spend the taxpayers' limited dollars on its programs and on its projects, how are we going to make a decision as to how these funds relate to the mission requirements. We need congressional oversight. We're given congressional oversight authority. This is part of congressional oversight, and it shouldn't be ignored. We have little choice other than to hold the department's leadership accountable and to cut requested and unjustified funding. So when DHS has a statutory mission to fulfill, we expect a legitimate and adequate budget to support it. When the law mandates a spend plan, we expect compliance. When we ask a question for factual information, we expect straightforward and prompt answers, instead of getting little more than excuses, delays, and outright irresponsiveness. And all that's got to stop, and it's got to stop today. Yesterday we were talking about, I talked to you on the phone briefly about the plans that we were not receiving, and you made the comment to try to get us to them by May 1st. I thought about that after our conversation, and that's not acceptable. Just because the president thinks he gets to be 2 months late on his budget doesn't mean that the people who work in his departments get to also ignore deadlines. We have deadlines that we have in this committee, and I think those deadlines should be met. And I think May 1st is too long to wait for those reports. So I'd appreciate it if you get whoever you hire or have hired to get the various reports done that we require. And if they can't remember what they are, we'll be glad to share that information with them. I'd like for them to have that for us by no later than the end of next week, Friday of next week. And I would like, and I'd also like to know who was assigned that job, because if they can't do the job, then there's a management problem somewhere. And we'll talk about. I'll give you an opportunity to reply to this, but I don't want to play the game. Others are having to, but I don't want to play the game of we'll give it to you when we want to. And honestly, we have a statutory mandate on a budget, but we didn't get the budget when it was statutorily mandated. We got it 2 months later. I'm not going to play that game. That's very simple. Our budget, at a time when our budget is hemorrhaging with red ink, the department has to get the budgeting right. That means meeting oversight responsibilities and clearly aligning requested funding to intended results for our nation's security. And that is a commitment I'm going to ask of you today. The American people deserve no less. Madam Secretary, I think it is clear that we have a lot to cover here today. Before I recognize you for your testimony, let me turn to our distinguished ranking member and former chairman of this committee for his remarks that he may wish to make. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Madam Secretary. It's a pleasure to have you kick off our budget season, a little later than usual, but we're glad to have you here. The fiscal year 2014 net discretionary budget request for the Department of Homeland Security is $39.04 billion, not including an additional $5.6 billion in disaster relief funding that does not count toward the discretionary cap. The total is some $550 million below the equivalent number for the current year. This year also marks the 10th anniversary of the creation of DHS and the continuing efforts to make 22 components operate under a common vision and leadership. Complicating these efforts is the reality that, like all federal agencies, you've been asked to do more with less, and this has required some tough decisions. I'm pleased that a full-year Homeland Security Appropriations Act was included in the final continuing resolution for the current year, providing an allocation of funds that is more aligned with your current needs. It provided significant and necessary funding increases, for example, for preparedness and anti-terrorism grants, for customs and border protection salaries, and for advanced research. However, you're still under the thumb of sequestration. Sequestration, the very definition of irrational and irresponsible budgeting, which ironically leaves the two main drivers of the federal deficit, tax expenditures and mandatory spending, largely untouched. Today I look forward to exploring how the department is assessing risk and prioritizing funding in this era of shrinking budgets. It's also time to reflect about where the department has been and where you're heading. This includes the Department's efforts to enforce our nation's immigration laws, which we all know are in need of comprehensive reform. As bipartisan efforts to craft legislation continue, no doubt security at the border will remain center stage. Despite what some opponents of comprehensive immigration reform say, significant progress has been made along the southern border. This subcommittee, under both Democratic and Republican leadership, has been at the forefront of these changes. We must resist misleading claims about border security by those who simply wish to block reform. 2 decades ago, fewer than 4,000 Border Patrol agents monitored the entire southwest border. By the end of fiscal 2012, there were more than 18,400 such agents. Fencing totaling some 651 miles has also been constructed in targeted areas of the border. Now, sensors have been planted, cameras erected, and unmanned aerial vehicles monitor the border from above. Couple these efforts with targeted outbound inspections of vehicles for illegal drugs, weapons, cash, and other contraband heading south into Mexico, resulting in some impressive seizures in California, Texas, and Arizona over the past 3 years. And you can see just how successful our border security efforts have been. You should be proud of how far we've come under your leadership and that of your predecessor to secure our border. Recalling our efforts to apply cost-effectiveness criteria to that border fence, I know just how elusive the definition of secure can be. I also know that we cannot simply throw an unlimited supply of money at the southwest border and assume it'll solve all the problems. We must continue to look analytically at the right mix of personnel, infrastructure, and technology to find the best path forward. And today we hope you can shed some light on your thinking in this regard. In addition, the administration has taken positive steps to improve its immigration enforcement policies. Here, too, some have been eager to criticize, but I believe it is both prudent and wise for the administration to focus on the removal of criminal aliens, first and foremost, while providing prosecutorial discretion on less pressing cases and deferred action in the case of the so-called dreamers. With limited resources, we simply must prioritize our efforts. Much has been made of the release of ICE detainees in February, although following Director Morton's testimony before this subcommittee, I hope we've reached the point where suspicions of a political motive have subsided. In that regard, I hope you could touch on the funding realities ICE must deal with when facing a statutory mandate that ties its hands on the number of individuals it detains. Director Morton has testified that this requirement, this statutory minimum bed requirement, will reduce such priorities as the investigation into human and drug smuggling, as well as child pornography. We need to get to the point where ICE decision-making about the use of detention is based only on consistent, reviewable, risk-based criteria, and that ICE has full discretion and available funding to use less costly supervision methods an alternative to detention when risk is low. I also support your efforts to better focus the Secure Communities program to make sure it's fulfilling its intended mission and not being applied indiscriminately. Now that the Secure Communities program has been implemented nationwide, I look forward to examining how effective this program has been in fulfilling its intended mission. This subcommittee also feels some ownership of that effort to focus on the criminal alien population. I must also commend you on the job FEMA continues to do. Over the past few years, FEMA has faced significant challenges, including an unprecedented 99 presidentially declared disasters in 2011. In comparison, 2012 had about half that number, with 47 presidentially declared disasters, but that number included Hurricane Sandy, a storm of historic magnitude. Currently, every state in the nation has pending disaster recovery projects with FEMA. In each of these instances, FEMA's done a remarkable job of working with affected areas to make sure that individuals, families, and localities have the resources to remove damaged structures and debris and to begin the rebuilding process. This recent experience confirms that much of the lost capacity we witnessed following Hurricane Katrina has been restored. Yet another success of which this subcommittee claims some ownership. Now, I must say there are some questions, some disappointments in this budget that we're going to want to explore. There is a net reduction in FEMA grants here. There is the same flawed proposal, I believe, for a national preparedness grant program. It was rejected by all sides in the continuing resolution. The budget also proposes a significant reduction to Coast Guard personnel and acquisitions that raises serious questions about future Coast Guard capabilities, recapitalizations efforts. Now, on the face of it, at least, this significant reduction in funding for the Coast Guard appears to have been made in order to provide a full $714 million to complete construction of the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility. Now, we know that facility must be constructed. But we've got to consider the implications for the rest of DHS, particularly if there is a viable option to phase in NBAF construction and avoid a trade-off with the Coast Guard or with other science and technology efforts in the coming fiscal year. So we have a number of questions that will need to be addressed by you and your colleagues as this subcommittee works to produce a bill in the coming weeks. Madam Secretary, I look forward to your testimony and working with you again this year.
Thank you, Mr. Price. I'd now like to recognize the chairman of the full committee and the founding chairman of this subcommittee, Hal Rogers, for any comments that he'd like to make. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your work on this as the new chairman of this subcommittee. Madam Secretary, it's good to be with you again. Good to see you. Tough job. Pardon me. In the past 3 years now, we've struggled on the committee and on this subcommittee to try to bring regular order to the process, where we take up individual bills and debate them and amend them and take them to conference with the Senate, and we hash out the differences like the old-fashioned way, which is regular order. And I'm very pleased that a couple of weeks ago now, we were able to work that process with our colleagues in the Senate and produce, I think, a fair hybrid continuing resolution, which included Homeland Security. And I wanted to congratulate Senator Mikulski and her counterparts in the Senate, along with my counterpart here, Anita Lowy, for working together to bring out a good bill. I know it's not exactly all that you wanted, but it's the best we could do. So the effort for regular order continues. Now, your budget submissions don't make our job any easier. Like Yogi Berra talked about deja vu all over again. Here we go again. The department has produced a proposal to, I think, decimate the Coast Guard and ICE that supports the men and women who bravely defend our homeland on the front lines, in favor of headquarters pet projects and controversial research programs. Once again, the budget request uses phony, unauthorized offsets to pay for critical aviation security measures. Once again, the department has failed to submit a number of plans and reports which are required by law, which are essential to help us do our work and do our work well, to try to justify every penny that we spend of the taxpayers' money under the Constitution appropriated to agencies of the federal government. And once again, this budget submission would add layers of bureaucracy to the already tangled web of agencies under your purview at headquarters. Many of these proposals are recycled directly from last year's budget. Nearly all of these misaligned priorities were patently rejected by the Congress in the Fiscal 13 bills that passed both chambers and the CR. These trends are becoming a sadly predictable asset and tenet of this administration's budgeting strategy. Particularly where our nation's security is involved, we need a legitimate budget that ties funding to results and mission requirements. Unfortunately, what I see here is a largely political document, which mirrors the fear-mongering tactics employed by DHS and others leading up to implementation of sequestration, especially ICE's release, opening the jail doors for several hundred detainees prior to the budget cuts. Needless to say, this gives me great concern. I certainly hope your testimony allays those concerns as we go on today. I hope and trust that it will. But we have rehashed these things ever since you've been the Secretary. We've gone over them time and again. And we reject your pleas, and you keep coming back, and we keep rejecting them. We should be spending this time talking about positive things rather than going over old, rehashed, rejected proposals. So I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're honored to have you here. We now are also honored to have the ranking member of the whole committee, Ms. Lowy. I recognize her for her comments. Thank you, Ms. Lowy, for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to also acknowledge that I join with Chairman Rogers in hoping that we could have regular order and go through the process and work together to accomplish our goals. I want to welcome you, Secretary Napolitano. It's been my pleasure working with you over the past 4 years to secure our borders, prevent acts of terrorism, improve cybersecurity, and provide our first responders with the equipment and resources they need to protect our communities. I would also like to thank you and Administrator Fugate for your handling of Superstorm Sandy. As our nation confronted one of the most severe and damaging storms in our history, you managed the federal response to the storm with precision. I also truly appreciate your regular updates for members so that we could get timely information to our local partners on the ground in the immediate aftermath of the storm. However, you come before us today with a budget that, again, would consolidate FEMA, state, and local grants into a large pot with little direction, without authorization from Congress, and expressly against the wishes of this subcommittee. I am concerned that efforts to consolidate these grants in such a way could result in diluting crucial anti-terrorism funds from areas most at risk of attacks. And it would leave transit and port security in the nation's most densely populated areas without the resources necessary to prevent and respond to acts of terror. I look forward to discussing this with you shortly. And again, I'd like to thank Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Price for holding this hearing today, and you, Secretary Napolitano, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy, and once again, welcome. Madam Secretary, your entire written statement, we have that. It will be entered into the record. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairman Carter, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lowy, Ranking Member Price, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the President's fiscal year 2014 budget for the Department of Homeland Security. There have been several points raised by you and others in their opening statements, and I look forward to addressing issues like reports and the FEMA consolidation with you during the Q&A part of the program. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the creation of DHS, the largest reorganization of the federal government since the formation of the Department of Defense. After 10 years of effort, DHS has transformed 22 legacy agencies into a single integrated department, building a strengthened Homeland Security enterprise and a more secure America better equipped to confront the range of threats that we face. Our workforce of nearly 240,000 law enforcement agents, officers, and men and women on the front lines put their lives at risk every day, securing our land, air, and maritime borders, enforcing our immigration laws, and responding to natural disasters. They work in every state and more than 75 countries, strengthening Homeland Security through cooperation, information sharing, training, and technical assistance with many of our partners. The President's 14 budget for DHS allows us to build on our progress over the past 10 years by preserving core frontline operational priorities. At the same time, given the current fiscal environment, this is the third straight year that our budget request reflects a reduction from the previous year. Specifically, the budget request is 2.2%, or more than $800 million below the FY13 enacted budget. While our mission has not changed and we continue to face evolving threats, we have become more strategic in how we use limited resources, focusing on a risk-based approach. This is coupled with an unprecedented commitment to fiscal discipline, which has led to over $4 billion in cost avoidances and reductions over the past 4 years through our efficiency review. Before I discuss the department's budget, however, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the mandatory reductions imposed by sequestration, which are significant, more than $3 billion in cuts across DHS over 6 months. The recent full-year appropriations bill enabled DHS to mitigate, to some degree, the projected sequester impacts under the CR on our operations and workforce. But there is no doubt that these cuts will affect operations both in the short and the long terms. Sustained cuts at these sequester levels will result in reduced operational capacity, breached staffing floors, and economic impacts to the private sector through reduced and canceled contracts. Nonetheless, we continue to do everything we can to minimize impacts on our core mission and employees, consistent with the operational priorities in our 2014 budget, which I will briefly highlight for you. First, to prevent terrorism and enhance security, the FY14 budget continues to support risk-based security initiatives, including TSA PreCheck, Global Entry, and other trusted traveler programs. As a result, we expect 1 in 4 travelers to receive some form of expedited screening domestically by the end of the year. The budget supports administration efforts to secure maritime cargo and the global supply chain by strengthening efforts to interdict threats at the earliest possible point. We continue our strong support for state and local partners through training, fusion centers, and information sharing on a wide range of critical Homeland Security issues. We also fund cutting-edge research and development to address evolving biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, including construction of the NBAF, a state-of-the-art biocontainment facility central to the protection of the nation's food supply and our national and economic security. Next, to secure and manage our borders, the budget continues the administration's robust border security efforts while facilitating legitimate travel and trade. It sustains historic deployments of personnel between our ports of entry along our borders, as well as continued utilization of proven, effective surveillance technology along the highest traffic areas of the southwest border. To expedite travel and trade while reducing wait times at the ports of entry, including both land and airports, the budget requests an additional 3,500 port officers, 1,600 paid for by appropriations, and the remainder by an increase to the immigration user fees that have not been adjusted since 2001. To secure our maritime borders, the budget invests in recapitalization of Coast Guard assets, including the 7th National Security Cutter and Fast Response Cutters. The budget also continues the department's focus on smart and effective enforcement of our nation's immigration laws. The budget supports the administration's unprecedented efforts to more effectively focus the enforcement system on public safety threats, border security, and the integrity of the immigration system through initiatives such as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals and greater use of prosecutorial discretion. At the same time, the budget makes significant reductions to inefficient programs like the 287G task force agreements, while supporting more cost-effective initiatives like the nationwide implementation of secure communities. The budget invests in monitoring and compliance, promoting adherence to worksite-related laws, Form I-9 inspections, and enhancements to the E-Verify program, while continuing to support alternatives to detention, detention reform, and immigrant integration efforts. Comprehensive immigration reform will help us continue to build on these efforts and strengthen border security by enabling DHS to further focus existing resources on criminals, human smugglers and traffickers, and national security threats. Next, to safeguard and secure cyberspace, this budget makes significant investments to strengthen cybersecurity, including funds to first secure our nation's information and financial systems and to defend against cyber threats to private sector and federal systems, the nation's critical infrastructure, and our economy. Second, support the President's executive order on improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity and the Presidential Policy Directive on critical infrastructure security and resilience. And finally, expedite the deployment of Einstein 3 to prevent and detect intrusions on government computer systems. Finally, to ensure continued resilience to disasters, the President's budget focuses on a whole-of-community approach to emergency management. It includes resources for the DRF, the Disaster Relief Fund, to support presidentially declared disasters or emergencies. And the administration is again proposing the consolidation of 18 grant programs into one National Preparedness Grants Program to create a robust national response capacity while reducing administrative overhead. This competitive, risk-based program will use a comprehensive process to assess gaps, identify and prioritize deployable capabilities, put funding to work quickly, and require grantees to regularly report on their progress. In conclusion, the FY 2014 budget proposal reflects this administration's strong commitment to protecting the homeland and the American people through the effective and efficient use of DHS resources. Chairman Carter, Representative Price, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today, and I'm pleased to be able to answer your questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. We're pleased to have you here today. As you know, FY13 requests shortchanged CBP operations, including failing to cover pay and benefits for the workforce. Addressing that shortfall put the subcommittee in a real tough spot. That was all last year. In order to fully fund personnel and operations, we had to make trade-offs in acquisitions, IT, and other initiatives. The bottom line is DHS budget needs to accurately and legitimately propose funding to cover known costs. I want your personal assurances that FY14 budget requests include funds necessary to cover known operational costs for CBP, including fully funding the essential needs of its frontline personnel, Border Patrol agents, CBP officers, air and marine interdiction agents. Do I have your assurance on that issue?
Mr. Chairman, I'd love to give you that assurance, but we're dealing here with an era where, for example, if sequester were to continue past the beginning of the fiscal year, we're going to continue to have impacts on CBP given the way sequester was drafted. So while I'd like to give you that assurance and we'll do everything we can in that regard, I can't give you a 100% guarantee.
Well, I understand that, and I think that's an honest appraisal because I've looked at your budget and I don't see how you could guarantee it, to be honest with you. But I wanted to see what you had to say about it. And you know, I noted something that I think it's important for us to remember, and I don't think I have to remind you, but I'm going to. Almost the first series of statements that you made, you called yourself a law enforcement agency. All right? You're about enforcing the law. That's our first and foremost priority in this job, is to enforce the law that exists today. If it's a bad law, we're going to work at fixing it. But until it's fixed, you get the law you got, and you got to enforce it. In many ways, you have my sympathy on that issue. I've been there on other laws that are pretty rotten myself, and I understand how that works. But that's not our job to question. It's our job to do. And so, in looking at this, with the money just starting with CBP, and it gets a lot worse in other places, especially with the Coast Guard, I have real concerns about their starting point on what we're doing here today. Quite honestly, I hate to come back to those reports, but that's why we want to know the thinking of the people who help put this thing together. It's critical for my team of people, our team of people, and Mr. Price's team and my team to know what you were thinking and what these people who you've given this responsibility to were thinking in proposing the numbers in this proposal you've given us today. So from that standpoint, I'm not going to beat that horse anymore, or I'm going to try not to. Okay, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We want to be as transparent as possible with the committee and work you through our thought process. I would note that we have, just for this subcommittee alone, 227 reports that are required. That doesn't even include the authorizing reports. Writing has become almost a whole section of the department, but we will move to get the reports. There are 16 some odd that were specified to be due May 1. We will move heaven and earth to get them to you earlier, but I just asked the chairman to recognize that reports, unfortunately, were not sequestered.
No, that's life, isn't it? I believe that your list counts monthly, quarterly, and quarterly reports separately. It seems a little bit of an exaggeration. We've been through all this before. If you're saying that monthly budget execution reports and quarterly acquisition reports are too onerous, we probably have a bigger problem than I thought. These are the very same reports I would think that you would demand to manage a department.
Many of the reports that I think the committee has specified at once really rely on being able to know what your FY13 numbers are. The FY13 numbers weren't available to a couple of weeks ago. That also has some effect. I appreciate the fact this committee is having a prompt hearing after the release of the budget, and I hope we can follow up on Chairman Mikulski, Chairman Rogers, and get back to some kind of regular order in the budget and appropriations process. It would make all of our jobs much easier.
I've been preaching regular order to many people for a long time. It is the backbone of being in Congress, so I'm for that. But to finish up on CBP, the budget proposes to bring on 1,600 additional CBP officers in 2014 using appropriated funds. The tail for that increase comes years later. After all the issues DHS has had to maintain staffing increases over the years, can you assure this subcommittee that DHS will support this increase in the out years?
The answer is our out-year budget does, and as I mentioned, Mr. Chairman, in my statement, the President's proposal is for roughly 3,400 more port officers, 1,600 of which are appropriated, the remainder for fee.
Moving on to something else, which is something that I've already gotten in the middle of in the last 3 weeks, is 34,000 detention beds. I've found the logic that's been argued to this committee very peculiar on this issue. Last year, you sat before this subcommittee and you testified that you did not need the capacity of 34,000 ICE detention beds mandated in the law. Yet earlier this year, ICE released detainees because they were operating at an extremely high level, reaching as many as 37,000 detainees in custody, and with an average daily population for the first quarter of 34,640 of detainees. With that, under that consideration, do you still think you don't need 34,000? Also, or let me answer that, do you still think, and under that number, and the fact that the big storm that was created by the release of these detainees across the country from coast to coast. Newspapers were screaming about it. TVs were blaring about it. And talk show hosts were going crazy. Under that circumstances, how do you argue that you don't need 34,000 beds?
Well, if I might, the President's request is for 31,800 beds. The reason for that is we are proposing to make greater uses of alternatives to detention, which are cheaper. The bed cost that we estimate will be about $119 per day.
Well,
but if I might,
let me ask a
Chairman,
question on that. Just saying.
If
you and I talked about this earlier, and you told me you'd tell me how many of those people were put on that alternative to detention, but I've never gotten that information.
We will supply it, but if I might, I think Representative Price made a very valuable point to this committee, which is we ought to be managing the actual detention population to risk, not to an arbitrary number. Of those released, there were very few, a handful of so-called level 1 offenders, but when you dig down into those cases, you'll find, for example, a 68-year-old who had 10 plus years after he'd committed an offense and was living with his family in New Mexico. So some of those cases on a case-by-case basis, clearly understandable. The department, the ICE, was facing a perfect storm when these releases occurred. We did not know we were going to have a budget. They were estimating we were going to continue under the CR, and the CR as sequestered. And so with that, and given the way that sequester worked account by account by account, reductions in ERO were required. But as we look at it, stepping back and look at it, really the policy decision for the committee is whether we stick to an artificial number of beds, or do we simply require that certain levels of detainees be in beds, and that we have those beds available.
I've heard this argument. You and I have had this argument before. I've also talked to the folks at ICE, and they follow the president's instructions. But here's the problem I've got with this. Right now, in fact, ICE has 36,000 detainees in custody right this time, and 96% of them meet the priorities set by this administration for detention, according to the priorities that you set. So, I mean, it's curious that these almost the rules start changing in the middle of the. And by the way, I love this argument about we release these people in anticipation, but it was very convenient that was right during the administration's "the sky is going to be falling" campaign, and I still question that action, because it certainly fell right within the pattern of the world is coming to an end if you have sequestration vote.
The 31,800 that we request, we believe will house all mandatory detainees, as all as level 1s and 2s. And as I said, level 3s are misdemeanants, and only certain misdemeanants. And those, we think, they're not released to the general population. They're put in a different type of supervision. It can be an ankle bracelet, it can be intensive supervision, what have you.
I'm very familiar with alternatives to incarceration. However, let me point out that you released 10 level 1s in this release that you did, and quickly after it became a national issue, rounded them all up again, which at least somebody was thinking. But I wonder if it hadn't been a storm on the horizon from the public, whether those 10 level 1 violators would still be on the street.
There's no doubt.
My time is running out.
Oh, okay.
I just want to point out that, I'm going to be very cautious about this 31,800 request. Okay, Mr. Price, this time I'll yield Mr. Price.